The early morning air felt unusually cold as Andrew Pearson, 33, a successful software developer, sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee. His family, Claire, his wife of 8 years, and their 2 children, Melody 7 and Tony 5, were still asleep, the house peaceful. But within moments, the tranquility was shattered. Suddenly, the door burst open, and officers in uniform flooded into their home, flashing badges that felt more like weapons than badges of authority. Andrew barely had time to process what was happening before they were shouting his name, grabbing him, and slapping handcuffs on his wrists. His mind raced. What was this about? They presented him with a search warrant, but it felt like a dream one that was turning into a nightmare with every passing second. In the chaos, Claire rushed out of the bedroom, frantic, calling his name. "What's going on?" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. But before Andrew could say a word, they yanked him out of the house, pushing him into the back of a squad car. He was stunned, his heart hammering in his chest. The children were screaming, clutching Claire's legs, confused and frightened. The officer who sat next to him in the car wasn't much help. "You'll figure it out," was all he said, coldly. Andrew tried to ask about the children, but when he spoke up, the officer threatened him with a warning he would never forget: "You're in no position to talk. Stay quiet." The arrest had turned his life upside down in mere minutes, and he hadn't even been told why. The questions flooded his mind. Was this a mistake? What was he being accused of? Why hadn't anyone explained? The truth, it seemed, was darker than Andrew could have imagined. As the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Andrew's wrists, his mind scrambled to piece together the mystery of his arrest. He could feel the weight of the situation crashing down on him, but the reality of what was happening didn't make sense. What had he done? What was happening to his family? Why were they treating him like a criminal? The drive to the police station felt endless. Andrew tried to focus, to hold on to any semblance of clarity. What is this about? What am I being accused of? He tried to speak up again, his voice shaky. His only concern was for Claire and the kids. He needed to know they were safe, that they were okay. But each time he asked, the officer beside him remained silent. Then the officer broke the silence. "Don't say another word," he growled. "You've already said too much." Andrew recoiled, fear and confusion bubbling in his chest. Too much? He hadn't said anything. He wasn't allowed to speak. The officer's cold warning had a deeper tone. It felt like they already had their minds made up about him, like they were waiting for something to fall into place, a plan already set in motion. When they arrived at the station, Andrew was shoved into a holding cell without explanation. The cold concrete walls seemed to close in on him, and for the first time he realized that nothing was going to be straightforward. He had no idea why this was happening or what they were accusing him of, but he knew one thing: it wasn't good. His heart ached for his family, who was left behind in the chaos. Andrew sat in the cold, sterile courtroom, his hands shaking despite his efforts to stay composed. This wasn't supposed to be happening to him. He was an ordinary man, a family man, a person who had worked hard his whole life. And yet here he was, sitting on the defendant's bench, trying to make sense of the storm that had erupted around him. The judge, an older man with an air of indifference, glanced at the paperwork before him before looking down at Andrew. "You're accused of solicitation of a minor and possession of child pornography," the judge said with no emotion, like it was something that happened every day. Andrew's breath hitched. Solicitation of a minor? Child pornography? The words were foreign, terrifying, completely incomprehensible. He felt as if the world had been yanked out from under him. How had things spiraled so far out of control? He was blindsided. No one had warned him about these charges, and now, sitting in front of a cold judge, he was facing accusations that would destroy his life. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Andrew tried to make sense of it all, but the more he heard, the more distant the truth seemed. The bail hearing was a formality, the judge uninterested in his side of the story, already assuming his guilt. No details were shared, no chance for him to even try to explain himself. The charges alone seemed enough to seal his fate. The lack of information, The urgency of it all made his head spin. He was guilty until proven innocent, a concept he never thought possible until now. Andrew's trial was a farce. From the very start, he knew something was wrong. His attorney barely spoke a word to him, offering only vague reassurances that meant little in the face of the overwhelming charges against him. The prosecutor, a man with an air of self-assurance, laid out the accusations with unshakable confidence, his words cutting through the room like knives. But what struck Andrew the most was the judge. The way he seemed to already have his mind made up, the dismissive way he glanced at Andrew, as if he were already guilty. The defense attorney, more interested in wrapping things up quickly than defending Andrew's innocence, never even questioned the evidence presented. Andrew's hopes dwindled as each moment passed. It became clear that no one cared about the truth. His side of the story was drowned out by the sheer weight of the accusations. The trial, which should have been his chance to clear his name, instead became a show of corruption and injustice. Despite his protests, despite his attempts to tell them that he was innocent, the jury was already swayed. The verdict came down swiftly, almost as if it had been decided long before Andrew ever stepped into that courtroom. Guilty. On all charges. The words echoed in his mind, and for the first time he felt the full weight of the unjust system he was trapped in. Andrew had always trusted Claire. She was his partner, his confidante, the one person who had shared his life with him. But now, in the wake of his wrongful conviction, she was about to betray him in the most painful way possible. After the trial, Claire wasted no time in starting the divorce proceedings. She took advantage of Andrew's situation, using his conviction as leverage to gain full custody of the children and demand an enormous settlement. She knew he was trapped, helpless. She had already cut ties with him emotionally, but now she was taking everything else. The children, the house, everything they had built together, it was all slipping through his fingers. He had no choice but to sign the papers, knowing that fighting would only prolong the inevitable. But what hurt more than losing his family was the knowledge that Claire was exploiting his pain for her own gain. She wasn't just divorcing him, she was using him as a stepping stone to secure her future, and the weight of that betrayal was heavier than any of the charges against him. Prison was nothing like Andrew had imagined. It wasn't the place of solitary reflection he had hoped it would be. Instead, it was a brutal environment where every day felt like a fight for survival. From the moment he stepped through the gates, he was branded with the scarlet letter of being a convicted sex offender. The other inmates looked at him with disdain, making it clear that he was a target. At first, Andrew tried to keep his head down, hoping to ride out the storm of hatred and violence around him. But it wasn't long before he became a target. The taunts, the threats, the isolation, they all came crashing in. It wasn't just the prisoners who made life unbearable, the guards were no better. They were indifferent, treating him with a cruelty that seemed to echo the very charges he was convicted of. Andrew quickly learned that to survive in prison, he had to fight back. He couldn't rely on anyone but himself. He found a mentor in another inmate, a former boxer named Vince, who had done time for a variety of charges. Vince took him under his wing, teaching him self-defense techniques that would soon become his lifeline. Andrew didn't want to be violent, but he knew that if he didn't defend himself, he wouldn't last long. In the shadows of his cell, during the long, sleepless nights, Andrew trained, pushing his body to the limit. Every punch, every kick, every defensive maneuver was not just about physical survival, it was about reclaiming control of his life. His mind became a fortress, his body the weapon that would protect him from the horrors of prison life. As the months dragged on, Andrew transformed. The man who had once been a family man, an innocent bystander in a twisted conspiracy, was now a fighter physically and mentally. But the toll it took on him was immense. Every bruise, every scar, served as a reminder of the injustice he had endured. Yet through it all, he never lost sight of the one thing that kept him going, the hope that one day he would be free. Outside the prison walls, Andrew's family was falling apart. Claire had divorced him, taking the children and the house, leaving him with nothing but memories of a life he no longer had. But Melody, his eldest daughter, refused to accept that her father was guilty. At only 10 years old, she had already seen the cracks in the story they had been told. It started with her refusal to believe the accusations against her father. Every time she looked at him, every time she thought about what had happened, something didn't add up. The way the trial had been rushed, the lack of evidence, and the cold, detached way everyone had treated Andrew, it just didn't make sense. Melody's determination grew stronger as she began to ask her mother the hard questions. One day, after weeks of questioning, she finally confronted Claire. "Mom, are you sure Dad did what they said he did?" Her voice was steady but filled with confusion and doubt. Claire's face hardened, her gaze cold. She had always been the one who made the decisions, the one who had controlled their family, but now Melody was challenging her. The confrontation was explosive. Claire tried to brush her off, telling her it was too complicated for a child to understand. But Melody wasn't having it. She kept pushing until finally Claire admitted that she hadn't even looked into the details of the case. She hadn't cared about the truth, she had only cared about protecting herself and securing her future. That was the moment Melody knew her father was innocent. The betrayal from Claire cut deeper than any lie Andrew had faced in prison. Melody was determined to find the truth, to uncover the evidence that had been ignored, and to expose the conspiracy that had shattered her family. Months passed, and Andrew's case seemed to be lost in the endless maze of the legal system. But Melody wasn't giving up. After her confrontation with Claire, she reached out to anyone who might be able to help her uncover the truth. Eventually, she made contact with a retired FBI agent, Thomas Reed, who had worked on several high-profile cases involving corruption and conspiracy. Thomas had been following Andrew's case from afar and had his suspicions about the investigation. When he began digging into the evidence, he discovered something chilling: key pieces of evidence had been fabricated, and the case against Andrew had been built on lies. Photos that were supposedly found on Andrew's computer were manipulated, and testimonies from so-called experts were falsified. It was clear that someone had orchestrated this entire ordeal. With this new information, Thomas worked tirelessly to track down the people responsible. As he got closer to the truth, he discovered that the conspiracy was far deeper than Andrew could have ever imagined. Corrupt law enforcement officers, a biased prosecutor, and even high-ranking officials were involved in the cover-up. Andrew's wrongful conviction had been a calculated move, designed to frame him and destroy his life. As the FBI team closed in on the culprits, they uncovered a web of corruption that spanned far beyond Andrew's case. The people who had framed him were powerful, but they had underestimated Melody's determination and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The truth was about to come to light, and those responsible were going to pay for their crimes. The walls were closing in on the conspirators. As the FBI gathered irrefutable evidence, they prepared for a massive takedown. One by one, the people responsible for framing Andrew were arrested. It was a moment of vindication, not just for Andrew, but for his family as well. Andrew's name was finally cleared. The officers who had manipulated evidence were arrested, and the prosecutor who had pushed for his conviction was disbarred. But the damage had been done. Andrew had lost years of his life to a false conviction, and the trauma of the ordeal would stay with him forever. Yet, in the midst of this victory, there was a bittersweet truth: the justice that Andrew had fought for had come at a great cost. His children were scarred by the lies they had been told, and his relationship with Claire was irreparably damaged. But through it all, Melody and Tony stood by their father, supporting him as he began to rebuild his life. In the end, it was Melody's courage that had brought the truth to light. Her unwavering belief in her father's innocence had been the spark that ignited the investigation. As she and Andrew stood together, watching the men responsible for his suffering being led away in handcuffs, they knew that justice had finally been served. But it was clear that their journey to healing was just beginning. The video concludes with a powerful moment of reflection. Andrew and Melody stand together, looking at a picture of their family from the past. The photograph, once filled with joy, now served as a symbol of everything they had lost. But through the darkness, they had found each other again. Andrew had been stripped of his dignity, his freedom, and his family. But now, as the conspiracy unraveled and the truth came to light, he realized that there was still hope for the future. He wasn't just a victim of injustice, he was a survivor, someone who had fought to reclaim what had been taken from him. With the conspirators behind bars and the truth finally revealed, Andrew and Melody began to rebuild their lives. Their bond, stronger than ever, became the foundation for the healing process. Andrew knew he couldn't change the past, but he was determined to fight for a better future for himself, for his children, and for the legacy of innocence that had been stolen from him. Thanks for watching. If you believe in the power of redemption and justice, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more updates.